Welcome, everyone, to this edition of Autonomous Vehicles in the City. We have a special lineup for you this year. I'm Billy Riggs with the University of San Francisco. Hope everyone is safe and healthy. And as you know, this is our fourth annual event, and this year we have a special lineup of all women leaders, and we'll have myself, as well as James Braswell, guiding us through 2 hours of really interesting sessions about, first, how automation is really responding to the pandemic, and what the future directions are for autonomous vehicles in our cities, what the policy opportunities are, and how we can accelerate and perhaps think differently about the technology going forward. Then we'll have a second panel that really focuses on how we power the future of transportation as we kind of move towards this autonomous future. I want to introduce James Braswell to you. He is one of our discussants as well. James is managing editor of Planetizen, which is a national land use urban design website, and he has previously worked at Cal Poly Pomona and led communications there, as well as been a freelance journalist for numerous institutions, including Curbed. So James will be helping me provide some framing for our amazing panels. But without further ado, I want to introduce our first panel. And so I'm going to just kind of briefly go through them, starting with Ellie Casson, who's head of city policy at Waymo. So Ellie has been responsible for guiding Waymo's approach to working in cities and bring their AV platform to market. She has a background in urban planning, politics, communications, and just brings a cutting-edge sustainability approach to the field of mobility. So if you want to say hi, Ellie, real quick, and just so we can hear your voice.
Sure. Hi, Billy. Hi, everyone. Pleasure to be here today. Thanks.
Yeah. All right. And so also we have Allison Malik, and Allison is with SAFE, and she was formerly COO of May Mobility. She serves as executive director on the Commission of Future Mobility, which is a SAFE project. And she's working really to enhance global mobility policy. Her background is actually working with OEMs and in engineering and electrification and autonomous vehicle startups. So thank you, Allison, for being here as well.
Thank you so much, Billy. It's great to be here and great to be part of the conversation today.
All right. Next, I want to introduce Prashanti Raman. Prashanti has 15 years of navigating challenging environments, and she directs global government affairs for Cruise, which is an all-electric autonomous vehicle company, and she oversees policy and the regulatory environment for them. Before Cruise, she was actually at Lyft and actually worked with one of our other speakers, I believe, there as well. So Prashanti, can we just hear a hi from you as well?
Yeah, hello. Thanks for having me, Billy. And I'm really looking forward to the conversations with a panel full of incredible women.
Awesome. And last but not least, Leah Theodoso. All right, I always mess up your name, Leah. Leah Theodosio Pisanelli. And Leah leads Aurora's partnership programs and basically focuses on this idea of the intersection of engineering, product, and partnerships for Aurora Innovation, which is really focusing on the logistics aspects of driverless technology. So Leah, thank you for being here. We'll just say hi real quick.
Thanks for having me. Looking forward to the conversation. And nice job. You almost got it.
Yeah, I almost got it. It's just
you tried. That's what matters.
A lot of syllables, and I knew I'd do that. It's all right. That's why I'm not a William. I'm a Billy. All right. So now that we've done some introduction, I think it'd be really great for our audience here to hear a little bit more about kind of who you are and kind of what approach you take. So maybe what you could do just to get us started here is just kind of introduce the role, introduce to your role and your company a little more, just to, who you are, what you do. So we'll go in that order, maybe Ellie, Allison, Prashanti, and Leah.
Sure, thanks. So again, my name is Ellie, and I'm the head of city policy at Waymo. Waymo, for those who don't know, is an autonomous driving technology company, and we're working to build the world's most experienced driver. And at Waymo, we believe that the Waymo driver, as we call it, can improve the world's access to mobility, while at the same time saving thousands of lives that are now lost to traffic crashes. And we're pursuing both an autonomous passenger ride-hailing service, Waymo One, and also autonomous goods delivery, which we call Waymo Via. And then my team, the city policy team, is responsible for guiding Waymo's approach to working with cities as we bring these offerings to market. So I have a small team that looks after our key markets and the issues that cities care about. And then I'm responsible for setting the overarching strategy for how we interact with cities and making sure we understand what they care about so that we can bring our business to market in a really thoughtful, informed way.
Thanks, Allison.
Hi, everybody. Allison Malik, it's great to be here. So I am really excited because we literally just this morning went public with the details about the Commission of the Future of Mobility. This is a project of SAFE, a nonpartisan organization that has historically worked at the intersection of energy and transportation. And with the Commission on the Future of Mobility, the effort is really to look out even further into the future and think about what are the actual outcomes that we want for transportation and mobility to have in our communities, and what are the policies that we need to enact to get there. Recognizing that technology is changing a lot of how we even move around today, from micromobility to rideshare, as well as autonomous technology and new electric vehicle technology. So the approach that we're taking as we think about how policy can change is actually to look at the areas in between the current focuses. A lot of times there's very siloed focuses on energy or safety, and that's totally separate from road funding or transit. We're trying to pull that all together and see how we can optimize policy to help really drive better outcomes across energy efficiency, safety, energy security, accessibility, and economic opportunity. So for the work that we're doing, we're looking for, across regions globally, from sort of federal level policy, state or nation level policy, all the way down to cities. So really excited to be here having this discussion today about city policy. And I do, as Billy said, I do come at this from a background of an operator, so have worked with cities directly on getting AVs out on their roads and working directly with the public in terms of providing transportation that's in partnership. So have seen a lot of different sides of this, and I'm really excited for the conversation today.
All right, Prashanti.
Hi, everyone. Again, Prashanti Raman. I am head of global government affairs at Cruise, where I oversee and strategize policy and regulatory issues and government affairs globally. So, working with legislators, regulators, and governmental stakeholders to advance autonomous vehicle policy in the United States, work more at the state and local level as well. So, what is Cruise? Cruise is actually an all-electric self-driving fleet company with the belief that the status quo has many limitations. So it's too polluting, it's far too unsafe, and it doesn't serve enough people. So that's really what Cruise is trying to change. Our long-term vision is a passenger ride-sharing service. We announced something called the Cruise Origin back in January, which is a completely driverless console, as in there's no steering wheel, there's no some of the operator controls, and it's in a campfire seating mode. And I'm sure I'll share in a little bit what we've also been doing during the pandemic as far as delivery of goods. So thanks again.
Well, I want to hear more about this campfire. Last but not least, Leah.
Hi, everyone. Leah Theodosio Pisanelli. I lead a team at Aurora that is responsible for the products we built and the programs that we have to deliver them. So we sit at the intersection between our engineering, our product, and our policy teams, and our partners, partners across automotive, trucking, logistics, mobility, all of the above. Have a little bit of a background in government, business, and product, so I bring those worlds together in this current role. A little bit about Aurora. Our mission is to deliver the benefits of self-driving safely, quickly, and broadly, very intentionally in that order. To do that, we've really focused on building a world-class team of over 600 people. We've forged alliances across the automotive world, and we've built a performant and adaptable Aurora driver, which can be used on multiple different platforms. So if we think about what is our product and how do we deliver those benefits, you'll first see it in trucking, then last mile logistics, and then mobility services. Excited to be here.
Thanks. And just because I did reference it earlier, Miss Theodosia Pisanelli used to work at Lyft. And that's the thing that I referenced earlier. We have a little bit of a team here that has actually been connected in past lives, and you'll see that throughout our discussions with these strong women. So so let's just start maybe with a question that I'll tee up for Prashanti and Ellie, and then Leah and Allison, if you want to chime in as well. It's just like, so we're now 9 months into a pandemic. And possibly going into a third wave, how has the pandemic kind of changed the way you think and the way you've operated with regard to your autonomous platforms or your automated platforms? Sure. Maybe let's start with Prashanti and then go to Ellie.
Thank you. I think we've all can acknowledge that these have been some pretty challenging times and have made us have to think about ways in which to solve different issues, both in our personal and career and with the companies that we are both all representing. I think the pandemic has obviously shown that AVs can help serve our communities today and how that impact can scale once there's greater availability and commercialization. And I think we all would share the sentiment that it's incumbent upon the industry to step up and sort of meet that call. For Cruise, as a San Francisco-based company, when the pandemic first took hold, we actually asked ourselves, what can we do to help and how can we do so safely? Acknowledging that food insecurity has been one of the most profound impacts from the pandemic, and demand has been completely unprecedented. And so San Francisco Marin Food Bank actually needed to reach thousands of people virtually overnight. So they needed a crisis relief delivery fleet to make that possible. And that's where we are able to come in and redeploy our fleet to perform this essential service and go where needed the most. Really excited that since April, when we stood up the program, Cruise has dedicated over 110,000 meals to households across San Francisco. Using our fleet of zero emission, 100% renewable energy powered autonomous test vehicles, and 80% being delivered to communities below the city's poverty line. I think it's important to that we don't solve one problem and create another. And so as wildfire season started in August and the Bay Area quality was the worst that it's been in that we've ever seen, it was a stark reminder that we can't continue to invest in what we know is broken. So earlier this year, we of course committed to powering our California fleet with 100% renewable solar energy. And another example of that is while we were delivering all those meals, Cruise has actually offset over 31 tons of emissions that would otherwise have been emitted by gas-powered deliveries. So, just by way of example, that's like the same as saving around 40 acres of forest from being chopped down. So that's incredible if you think about what the benefits could be at scale.
That's cool, and I think we're going to come back to this global climate, theme with some of our other speakers. So Ellie, maybe we can talk about how you've, what you've done. What's Waymo's approach since the pandemic been?
Sure. So when the pandemic initially started, we paused our operations everywhere, and that's Arizona, Bay Area, Michigan, Texas. So everything was put on hold for some time until we could ensure that we were able to resume operations safely. And we did a lot as a company to figure out how to bring our service back in a way that ensured the safety of our drivers and our, because we do have safety drivers in some of our vehicles, and our riders, because we are offering a fully driverless service for members of the public in Arizona. So before, we let anybody back into our cars, needed to make sure everybody was safe. And safety has always been at the core of what Waymo does. It was the reason that we were founded back when we were part of Google as an experimental project. And I think the pandemic's added a layer that we didn't anticipate, which was that not only could a fully autonomous driver make transportation safer in terms of reducing crashes, but that it also could potentially reduce exposure to infection. So something we're all thinking about in a way I think no one ever expected we would. And I feel like we've developed a best-in-class approach to ensuring the safety of our riders and our team. I will say, as the person that's thinking about city issues, as we get back to sort of normal or like prepare for the new normal, I'm concerned that in a post-COVID world, that there might be some progress lost on all of the work that cities have done to promote some of their other goals, like around getting folks out of personally owned and operated cars and onto public transportation. So I've been spending a lot of time thinking about how a fleet-based autonomous passenger service like ours can be used to support safe mass transportation and prevent a huge spike in personal car ownership and use, which I think we were heading in the right direction slowly in cities across the country. And I think, there's a potential to see a big step back. And I want to figure out what Waymo can do to be a part of the safely, preventing that from occurring in whatever way we can.
I mean, the tension in terms of exposures is almost another corner case, right? So here we have this situation, and I think it'd be interesting maybe to come back to you two after we hear about this in terms of like, Prashanthi, you said you're thinking about a campfire style vehicle, but I mean, clearly this type of vehicle where you have joint exposure is a risk. And so Ellie, I'm not sure if you all are continuing with the iPace model, but I'm just not sure how this works in a shared scenario for the next year when we see many of our ride-sharing companies struggling with the shared service model. Leah, Allison, anything to contribute in terms of your thoughts? Maybe Leah and then Allison.
Yeah, I would just add, I would echo what both Prashanthi and Ellie have said. And I would add from our perspective, an additional perspective is we're really, as we're thinking about trucking, right? You can imagine that the e-commerce boom has had a pretty significant impact on some of our customers in the space. And it's pretty interesting to look at what that world looks like now and how it will change over time as we get back to some sort of a new normal. But what we're seeing now is a huge shortage of drivers, of trailers, of overall capacity. And so it's been really interesting to see this big shift in how the overall logistics industry is coping with all the after effects or current effects of COVID-19. And so it's really just led us to doubling down on our efforts to get this technology out there, to move goods and to think about how we move people as well as we sort of build back our economy and this new way of life. The other thing I'd add is, and Prashanthi mentioned this on sort of a personal note, but spending a lot of time with our teams and making sure that everybody within Aurora is in a good place in this current situation, and both personally, and then that we can keep doing work. And so we've benefited from really early investments in what we call our virtual testing suite. Others call it simulation, so that we can continue to make really rapid progress in a virtual setting so that our development doesn't slow down as some of us or most of us are working from home. So, putting the investment in that early in our company before we could have ever anticipated something like this would happen has really paid dividends here.
And just to clarify, Leah, for the audience who you're saying that basically you're able to simulate in the lab setting more or less some of the driving experience that would parallel what you would do out on the road. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, and most AV companies have some form of this technology. It's something that we, in starting the company later in sort of the evolution of self-driving companies coming to the space, we sort of had the forethought to really invest heavily in simulation for a number of reasons. Part of it being safety, part of it being development velocity, and kind of getting at the cutting edge of how we can rapidly iterate. It just so happens that that has also really benefited us in a work from home situation, because we can continue to progress our development without actually having to be on the road to collect all of those miles.
Yeah, thanks, and that is good. I know that is cross-sectional across many of these companies. So,
yeah.
Allison, any thoughts about this as well?
I think just picking up on what Prashanthi and Leah have talked about, the movement of goods. I think, before the pandemic, there's a lot of discussion about people moving with autonomous vehicles, and with the pandemic, both how to move people in the same area safely is a discussion, but I think the push towards logistics and the movement of goods has really accelerated, which is exciting. And one of the other things that I've really seen pick up is awareness for last mile delivery options as well. So you've got companies like Refraction AI, like Neuro, that are using totally different form factors specifically focused on the movement of goods, going out there and helping with contactless delivery. I think pre-pandemic, it was sort of like, okay, maybe this is a nice to have. But in the pandemic, I think people are appreciating how nice it is to be able to have that as an option.
Yeah, and we've seen that at USF, we work with a company out of Stockholm called Buzz, terrible name, trust me, but they actually have been able to use their electric tuk-tuk platform or electric mini pod platform to basically take on all the contactless food deliveries for Bolt in Europe, as well as Foodora. And so I think there is like this use case that exactly what you're doing is thinking about how logistics and carrying people as well as products can perhaps coexist. And it'd be interesting to dive deeper into kind of what those platforms look like based on kind of different types of built environments. But so maybe we can just kind of open the discussion out about kind of where we see kind of potential potential corner cases. We talked a little bit about use cases, but things that we think that we are anticipating now are obstacles to us really accelerating. And you all have different angles, but what are the things that you're seeing that could decelerate or accelerate what you've been working on and what you've been trying to do over the coming year, particularly, and maybe short-term tactical, but long-term strategic. Maybe let's start with Ellie, since we started with Prashanthi next. And I think I want to dial, Leah, I want to have a specific question with you a little later, just to think about the idea of, again, of what you cited in terms of labor shortage in your market. So Ellie?
Sure. So Billy, you're asking what could potentially like accelerate or slow down our path?
That path to higher levels of automation. I think we hear a lot about, level 5 and sometimes it feels like it's hocus pocus, but so what will get us there? What will give us to this vision of safe, shared, and electric autonomous or automated travel?
Yeah, well, you mentioned level 5 automation, and I think there's a lot of confusion out there about the levels of automation, the actual definition of autonomous driving, and I actually think that's a potential threat to making progress towards higher levels of automation, because that confusion could arguably be a little bit dangerous if it leads to decision makers trying to pump the brakes on maybe a part of the industry that they see as not safe and negatively impacting the progress of the industry as the whole. There's a woman named Liza Dixon who's coined a term called autono-washing. And because it's a new field, it's a complex field. There's nuance that can sometimes get lost. And for example, there's driver assist technology, like you see with Tesla. There's fully autonomous driving, which is what we're pursuing. We had historically explored driver assist and then made a very conscious choice to pivot around 2012 and pursue full autonomy because we felt like it was the only way to, that ambiguity was not something that we felt like drivers could handle. Am I expected to take over? Am I a passenger? We felt that it needed to be clear in order for it to be truly safe. So I think that autonomous washing and just sort of a lack of clarity, which will probably, over time get sorted out, but before it becomes very clear, could regulators understandably feel that they needed to step in and create some barriers that slow the industry down as a whole. So that's something that at Waymo we're trying really hard to communicate with the general consumers and decision makers about what exactly it is that we're pursuing, full autonomy, and why we believe that's safe and should progress.
And I just want to point out really quick, there is a group called the Partnership for Automated Vehicle Education that's doing a lot of important work in this space, because Ellie, you bring up a really good point. There's a lot of driver assist technology that is being promoted in a way that's really, really confusing for the general public. And as we try to build this understanding and this sense of trust in the technology in trying to use the services, this type of public education, both for the public at whole, but also regulators, is incredibly important. If we can't get people's trust, then none of us can grow, you all can't grow businesses. I can work on policy, but you all can't grow businesses in this space, which is ultimately the end game, is to provide more transportation to more people. But in order to do that, there has to be that foundation of trust, and understanding the lingo is really the place that we need to start and still have some work to do.
Yeah, and I want to, I think we're going to have a lot of consensus around this in this room about just making sure we're clear about what the technology can do and being very clear about that. And so I kind of want to put a pin on this, and I'll fully admit that I've had to adjust my language into more the Europeans are very clear that they talk about automated vehicles and not autonomous vehicles. Because it is a slippery slope when you start thinking about that. So I started, this is the autonomous vehicle symposium, and yet we focus on automation. And I think when we think about that, that just gets us away from this idea of fully self-driving. But Prashanti and Leah, maybe we could just pick up, and Ellie, you and Allison, feel free to chime in, but just pick up this idea. Okay. As we accelerate this trend towards automation, what should what should policymakers worry about, and what should people, particularly in schools of management, schools of policy, schools of urban planning, what should we be talking about? What should we focused on in terms of urban issues as this technology develops?
Sure, I'll take the first go at that. Thanks, Leah. So I think want to kind of double click on something that both Allison and Ellie had talked about with regards to working with regulators and elected stakeholders to ensuring that they both remain flexible and iterative in their approach, so as to not to overly prescribe the industry before it even gets started. I think that has been sort of the push and pull on this at the state and local level for them, number one, to understand the technology and really understand the behavioral shift that needs to happen to get someone out of the car and what that looks like, but then also figuring out what a regulatory framework actually looks like. And then not getting too hyper local about it. As transportation is, it's inherently transient. And so in order to make sure that there's the flexibility and the capability for companies like Cruise to continue expanding and as a pathway to commercialization, too limited of like a patchwork of regulations at the local level is not going to be a great great way to start. So, you know, if a locality borders another locality, chooses to like prescribe one set of regulations, and then the very next neighboring community ties us to another one, and then there's, you know, there's an impasse there, and it essentially like breaks down the model before it even can get going. So I think I wanted to double click on that point. And I think secondly, you know, in this, I think would be remiss not to talk a little bit about what happens in this post-COVID world, or in this COVID world. You know, it's also incumbent upon the companies to be able to iterate their own technologies and to figure out how to, you know, solve some of the consumer behavioral issues. For example, I know you had, Billy, you were like, how are you doing a campfire seating when there's a pandemic happening? You know, I think the idea is now that we've worked with a Harvard epidemiologist, we're following WHO and CDC guidelines to figure out how to enhance our HVAC system, maybe only have 2 people in the car, have a zone partition, keep antiviral surfaces, and have hand sanitizer and wipes, and make sure that there's a robust cleaning that's happening at our operational hubs. And so I think it's both sides of the coin that we need to kind of look at it from a different perspective. I think the final thing I would just note, and I know that this is a panel that you're going to focus on in sort of the next session, but I think I'd be remiss to not at least talk about how cities can be focused on tangible ways to fight climate change. And they should be looking at transportation networks to curb emissions. We saw what was possible with fewer cars on the road. It's like been the biggest decline in carbon emissions we've seen in decades. And so I think as transportation is one of the biggest offenders in climate change impacts, we need to ensure that we are committing to those zero emissions and renewables. You know, Governor Newsom just released a very ambitious set of goals for the state of California. And so, you know, I think there's an opportunity for the AV industry to partner with cities to potentially even beat those goals. So.
Yeah, let's maybe, I appreciate the cognitive framework, but let's maybe drive down even more granular. You suggested, Prashanti, that like you're making tacit changes in your vehicles. And maybe so I actually, that's really interesting. Like thinking about services and thinking about the way you're thinking about it, the interior of that shared vehicle. But also, I think let's not be vague about what you're thinking about at the local level. Elliot, you and I have had offline conversations about here's what we're thinking about with regard to thinking about cities. And I know, Allison, you've thought about very distinct policies that cities can do like today to facilitate all types of mobility and do it in a sustainable way. So maybe we could hear about that, and then and Leah, feel free to chime in as well.
Well, I think for us in San Francisco, one of the most urban, complex driving environments, our cars are scanning dynamic driving conditions all the time. So having clear and maintained infrastructure, consistent signage is incredibly helpful, though not essential. When it comes to curb space, what's important is ensuring that we are working with local planning organizations to put out information that supports that dynamic transportation system, where, for example, on Market Street, is a car supposed to pull over? If not, how do they avoid those high passenger corridors potentially? And so I think that there are ways in which that, you know, we have to get down to the local level to ensure that we are maintaining a great collaborative partnership.
I think adding on to that, yeah. So one of the things that I always talk with communities about as we think about bringing AVs into the community, they're absolutely sort of the operational, where do we pick up, where do we drop off type of questions that need to be solved. But oftentimes the questions are around, how do I know that this is safe? How are you going to be safe for my community? Happy to dive in on sort of the wonky engineering standards side of what needs to be expanded because existing standards don't quite cover it. But on the city side, a lot of times the things that can improve AV safety and operation are things that improve everybody's lives. Making sure that there is space for pedestrians and that there's not, you know, a half a mile between road crossings. That's not actually useful as pedestrians. It frankly encourages jaywalking. I'm frequently a pedestrian, frequently a cyclist in the city of Detroit. And it's usually like, man, this is so designed for cars. It's way more inconvenient when you're trying to get around on foot out in the weather. And so when I talk with communities, it's a lot about how do you make sure that your other active modes, to the point that was made earlier, if we want Many cities want to be pulling people out of single occupancy vehicles, reducing overall traffic and congestion. In order to do that, you have to give them other options. They're not going to stop moving around. So you see a lot of trends towards how do you make 15-minute neighborhoods so people aren't, going 5 miles to run an errand to get to a grocery store or to a pharmacy. You see a lot of efforts, and this is one thing that I think will be really interesting as we continue in the pandemic, but just to see how much road space is actually given up to active forms of mobility, and it's creating a new dialogue around infrastructure. Who uses it? Why do they get to use it? Why do I not get to use it? And I think that dialogue around pedestrians and cycling and active mobility is great, because if we can create space for those individuals, it helps to improve road safety for everyone. But then it also creates the opportunity for discussion around prioritizing transit, prioritizing shared transportation, more than just sort of HOV lanes that you're familiar with in California, but how do you actually do that even within the confines of the city? So I think this coming out of the pandemic, it's really helping us to rethink our road use, which is a great thing. And I think something that's going to be a really colorful and valuable conversation as we go on.
That's right. And we've been saying this for a while, Allison, haven't we? We for those of you that have been attending this conference and come to see us at Autonomous Vehicle Symposium in the summer, Allison and Ellie and I have been talking about this idea of roadway trade-offs for 4 or 5 years, and we probably will be for 4 or 5 years more. Leah, any thoughts? And Ellie, I want to come back to you with a little more detailed question as well. So, Leah.
Yeah, I would echo others' thoughts here. I would just say at a high level, this technology and both developing it and bringing it to market, it requires support from many facets, right? It's not just government, it's not just AV developers, but it's a lot of different participants, right? It's the OEMs that are involved, the technology companies, the fleet management companies, the logistics industry. We all have a responsibility to come together with our individual strengths to offer a holistic approach, not just in the development, right? So building this technology and proving that it's safer than a human driver is a Sisyphean feat that I could talk about for hours. But I know that's only the beginning. So I think really focusing on how we can bring everybody together to take on that responsibility of educating our communities, working closely with those that make decisions about changes in infrastructure or city planning. I just want to emphasize that point of this sort of, we all need to be real participants here and take some responsibility in that conversation and be inclusive in perspectives as we decide what the best path forward is.
And I love it's not Herculean, it's Sisyphean. So in true mythological fashion.
Yeah.
But so I actually, one thing just to I'll use Prashanti's term, double click down for you, Leah, is that you brought up labor, and the last time I heard us talk about labor and trucking logistics was Pete Buttigieg, and that was a century ago, right? What about this labor shortage, and are you having dialogues about how labor impacts what you're doing? Is there, what kind of policy dialogues could we be having, and where should they be had on this idea of the labor market as exists today for logistics and what it might look like 5 years from now?
Yeah, we all are, right? We have to have that conversation. Anytime we talk about introducing technology into the market that's going to have some sort of an impact, we need to be having that conversation across the board, right? So I think the most important thing is that when we have these conversations, we don't just think about what do we know in the world today and how exactly is that going to change, right? So I've found over time, both in working in trade and automation and a few different industries, is that when we think about how we prepare for the future, we have to be creative in thinking about the opportunities that this new future brings as well. So we need to understand what the impact is going to be, and we can't understand that in isolation. So it speaks to the broader point of just we need to be collaborating with a variety of different groups in those conversations. It's hard for me to be prescriptive here on what I think specific labor policy should look like with respect to autonomous vehicles, but I would just say that it needs to be a collaborative conversation and everybody needs to be involved. And it's something I believe anybody in this industry is thinking about.
Right. No, and I think it's just that we can maybe come back to this. And I know, Allison, I think you have some thoughts about this as well. But, you know, labor and human dignity are going to be in continued topics. And it's one thing that I know the four of you and the three of our next panelists are very in agreement on, that human dignity is really important, and access to transportation, access to housing are ways that we give people human dignity, and we actually promote social mobility. And with that, I want to just, Ellie, you and I have talked a little bit offline about kind of, you know, about two things. It's like, well, what about infrastructure to support electrification, and what's this relationship with between housing and transportation, and how do AVs fit into that equation?
Sure. I don't think that this topic, the topic of housing and fully autonomous driving, actually comes up enough. And I hope it starts to, because I think that cities, when I am out talking to city leaders, they have a lot of questions about the impact that a company like Waymo will have on their community. And what I try whenever possible to do is remind them that it was said earlier by a couple of folks here that the same things that will help a company like ours expand, or will sort of either we will come to a community and improve upon, or perhaps exacerbate a certain condition, it is really going to be about the conditions that already exist in their community. Affordable housing, a healthy jobs housing balance. It's a very serious challenge for the Bay Area and California as a whole. I think that we really need to remember that transportation issues are housing issues. And so I think there are concerns about, will autonomous driving induce demand, encourage people to that make people feel that they can take longer commutes, have longer commutes because they won't be actually behind the wheel, so it won't be quite as painful. Those things are possibilities, but if we have communities where our jobs and housing balance is more in line, I think we're less susceptible to those challenges. So I try to remind city leaders that those are things within their control, and a company like ours needs to be aware of and sort of aligning our tech to enable those goals. But we're not actually disrupting that. We're going to be feeding into the conditions that already exist today. And the one thing I do say to cities, when they ask, well, do you need, are there special conditions or special infrastructure that you do need? EV infrastructure is crucial. Cruise, Waymo, we're all working towards offering a fully electric service. And today there isn't enough EV infrastructure to support the service that we hope to deploy. And so that is an area where I think, and Allison, I think you talked about the governor's ambitious electric vehicle goals. That's definitely going to be important to the rollout of our technology.
And I think it's important to contextualize that, you all referenced to California. We do have a global audience here, and that these are global trends. And I think what we're talking about, and regardless of what happens in the U.S. elections next week, we do have an urgency to wean ourselves from limited and scarce natural resources. And as we think about what that looks like, supporting the electrification and shared nature of our transportation is only an asset. And I think I know you all agree with that, but maybe I want to just start kind of maybe coming to some final thoughts from each of you about kind of, where a lot of this doesn't happen without working together. And so maybe we could just talk about, and in kind of kind of organic fashion, where do you think the key partnerships need to be over the coming years to achieve this more utopian society that you've talked about? And I think we don't have to talk about these in polar extremes, but where are the key partnerships? And then also, if you could just talk about at the same time, and we can just do this one by one. We got a lot of young people that are on the line that are watching. We got a lot of people that may be thinking about different fields, maybe thinking about career switching. What do you have, particularly for young leaders, young female leaders? What kind of advice do you have that maybe people that may want to enter the space of automation? They may want to enter the space of transportation policy, transportation planning, and engineering. Any words of wisdom there as well?
I'll try to do both of those at once. I think that I'll take the former question first, and then kind of get into some of the things that matter a lot to me on a personal level, which is mentoring young women, and young people in general. I think it's the partnership piece is not something that you can think of just in isolation, because it needs to happen not only at the community level, it needs to happen in the neighborhoods, it needs to happen, of course, with your interested stakeholders at an organizational and governmental entity. I think you have to focus on a few of the existing gaps that we've been talking about, not only from infrastructure and the climate change perspective, but also through an equity lens. One of the things that is foundational to Cruise is to ensure equitable access to autonomous vehicles. So, something that Ellie was sort of, talking to a little bit before, we want the experience of getting into an AV and an all-electric one at that to be agnostic. So it breaks down barriers that have ever been present in transportation. So, those individuals who have never had the chance to be in an AV, essentially bridging that digital divide that so often exists when introducing new technologies to various communities. And so in order to do that, developing partnerships that are authentic, but also advancing some of these larger objectives. I think for us at Cruise, we found an incredible partner with SF Marin Food Bank and SF New Deal, based on kind of serendipitous, the serendipity of the pandemic, but also because we had been engaging, in the neighborhoods from a testing standpoint for many months before that. And so I think from that standpoint, to really understand what's authentic about that partnership and making it genuine. And I think that actually feeds over into my young people advice. And I think those three folds are, know your passion, excel at your craft, and have your own personal board of advisors. I think the beauty of tech companies, particularly startup ones, is the ability to create, mold, iterate on your positions. So it's not just about being an engineer, although of course that's very crucial to the success of autonomous vehicles. But know that there's an opportunity to contribute, whether you want to go into marketing, operations, analytics, or of course government affairs. And so I think understanding what drives you and is authentic and genuine to yourself is something you have the opportunity to bring into the autonomous vehicle space, because it's so nascent right now. So it's a little bit for me.
Allison, are you going to jump in?
Jump in next. Yeah. From a partnership perspective, I think building on what Prashanthi talked about in terms of real relationships with community members, I think it's also actually important that we understand, both sides of business models at the community level. Every company that works in the AV space has to make money on their service. And that's one of the things that I think is going to be challenging as we think about equitable access. If you've got communities that are farther flung, have less access, just geographically to jobs, the business case of providing that service doesn't always add up until you bring more partners to the table. And that's where I think as cities are trying to understand how AVs can help or hurt, they need to think about who they need to serve and how to bring partners together that can really think about making sure that that service achieves the outcomes that they want to see. And I think we also all need to be aware that over the next few years, cities and their transportation agencies and their budgets are going to be struggling. And so as we talk about equity we're really going to have to dig in over the next 2 years to make sure we can deliver as our cities try to recover from the tax income deficit that they've had over the past few years. I think it's also going to be important at a federal level to have more companies partner. I think it is important that we have flexibility for companies right now to be able to experiment and iterate on their technology. But at the end of the day, to have a scaled impact with giving millions of people transportation, we will have to figure out a framework for safety that every company can buy into. That every company can say, yes, whatever it is, here's how we meet it. There's a lot of precedent in terms of the physical design space as it exists today for vehicles. But we have to get creative because, especially with the amount of things like machine learning that are used in these vehicles, it's a different paradigm. And that's where I think industry leaders are still a little bit nervous to come together, but it's something that we really need to do, because being able to pull that together is what, again, will allow not only to get to those higher levels of automation and say, yes, we're safe, but then allow that operation at scale. To my sort of recommendations for people getting into the field, I want to echo what Prashanti said about, yes, being an engineer is great. I have an engineering background. I haven't worked in engineering in autonomous vehicles at all, except for my team would often ask me questions on EV charging, because that is my area of expertise. But there's plenty of ways to get involved. And this industry is so new. I think for anybody, even if you don't want to go into AVs, from a career perspective, if you can get in early in a new technology or new industry, you actually get to be an expert at a much younger age and get a lot more latitude, which is something that I've done in my career and had a lot of fun with. But it also means that you need to be able to translate the experiences that you've had into a new space. So very few people have worked in marketing for autonomous vehicles. Very few people have worked in operations for autonomous vehicles. So if you want to get into the space, don't hesitate to say, hey, I have experience from, this other field. It's relevant. Pitch yourself that way and don't downplay the experiences that you have had.
May I jump in, Billy? Because I really agree with what Allison what you just said about this being a new industry, and so it means there aren't really a lot of experts. Maybe now, a few years in, you're starting to see people sort of emerge as experts in this area. But I certainly didn't come to Waymo as an expert in autonomous vehicles, and I think, Allison, what you said about just kind of find the experience that is can be applicable, and go for it. The one thing I'd add, though, is that there might not be a lot of experts out there, but this is a field that a lot of people want to work in. It's very kind of, hot right now, trendy. And so whenever Waymo, I'll just talk specifically about Waymo job openings, whenever we open a position, we get so many applications. And I know that there's incredibly talented folks that we might not get to review every single resume that comes in when there are literally thousands. So network like crazy. And I think that applies to I would say that's advice I'd give to anybody in any field, but certainly for this one, because we're really looking for talented folks. And if we know that someone's out there and interested and eager, we'll talk to them, but easy to miss talented people. So network and apply. I mean, just as a word to women in particular, we're expressing some frustration that we recently had some open roles at our company and very few women applied. And we were like, it's positive it's not because there aren't talented women out there. So what can we do to encourage more of them to apply in the future? Because sure, they don't have all of the experience that we would hope for, but neither do the men who are applying. Nobody does. New field, right? So please do apply and then let us know that you've applied so we know to check you out. That would be my sort of practical advice. And then in terms of partnerships, the one silver lining I think of the pandemic is that it has kind of turned everything on its head, and everything, it seems, more flexible than it did before. Things we used to take for granted, that this is the way the public sector works, this is the way the private sector works. Everybody has to be more flexible right now, and I think there's an openness to partnerships that I've never seen before, and that does make me optimistic in a time when things are really challenging. It seems like cities and companies are more willing to talk to each other and experiment than I have ever seen before.
Yeah, and just to put it, you have a partnership, I believe, with Valley Metro right now, and so the particularly, I think it's come up a couple times that transit, potential for transit partnerships here, and this is a tee up for you, Leah, because your former company has a big one in Southern California. Is huge, and it's a big opportunity. So Leah, maybe take us home, and then we're going to hear from maybe some parting thoughts from James.
Great. Yeah. So I. Again, would echo everything that my fellow panelists have said. I think that on the partnership side, there's so much that needs to be done to get this technology out there, to prove that it's safe. It is a truly once in a century opportunity to be part of this space. And I think the only way we get there is if we have a diversity of viewpoints. And that's a diversity from a variety of different types of companies, of different players in parts of the ecosystem, of state, local, federal authorities, in all different corners of the government. I think we all need to come to the table seeing the real benefit that this technology will bring. And I agree, I think COVID has been a little bit of an equalizer. It's kind of forced everybody to really focus on what truly matters and how do we get this technology out there safely and as quickly and broadly as possible. The thing that also sort of parlays into how I think about giving advice to folks that want to join the industry, there's a place for you here, and it is brand new, and it might feel intimidating because it can be incredibly technical at times, or it can be incredibly steeped in sort of the traditional automotive world, or feel like there's a lot of urban planning wonkiness that you need to be successful. But the truth is, all of the leaders that I know and that I've worked with, and including this team here, have come from a diverse set of backgrounds that have molded them into leaders for this industry. I'm a former trade negotiator who launched payments products in international markets and worked on ride sharing policy. And here I am leading product and programs for an AV tech company. So there's opportunity here. Own your experience, master your craft, as others said, and there's a seat at the table. You've just gotta get here and tell us you want to be here. And yeah.
Leah, this thing, since I think what you emphasize as well is, and what you bring to the table is also that the industry is huge. It's not just people working on the software side. It's not just people working on the hardware side. It's a really good setup for our next session, which are really people that are working on super granular aspects of how we power the future, how we build the batteries, how we get the metals, how we actually pay for the energy to make all this possible. And there's a lot of startups in this space too. And I think that's important to remember, that you don't have to work for a Waymo or a Cruise, or you don't have to work for a company that may be the biggest name, but there are seminal parts of this industry that really where we need to innovate as well. So James, maybe we could just, I've asked you to come just be a little discussant here and to kind of provide some overarching thoughts about what does all this mean to cities, particularly now, and kind of we see this reality has changed. Maybe a couple minutes, and then for everyone out there, we're going to take about a 3-minute break and then invite our next panelist here. So James, what do you think?
Yeah, thanks, Billy. I've been taking copious notes while you've all been talking, and I really appreciate the chance to chime in, and all of your expertise and eloquence has been really impressive. And before we met for this meeting, we had a preview meeting, and there was some discussion about how many of the panelists previously worked in the public sector, and I think it's really obvious that all of them have an interest beyond corporate profit in social good, and I really appreciate that, and I see that really informed this discussion today. And I really want to take an opportunity to thank you for being here. I'm a journalist. I've been writing about planning and land use and urban design for over a decade. And there's a lot of intersections with questions. Somebody already said transportation policies is housing policy or land use policy. And that's really obvious. I also have to give a shout out. My mom is a USF alumna, and I'm very proud of her. So I'm very happy to be here on the USF panel. But first of all, the big question that planners are facing when it comes to autonomous vehicles of all varieties is, is this technology going to enable another round of sprawl, which we know to be destructive environmentally, socially, and economically? Ellie mentioned the intersection between housing and these big questions about housing and jobs balance. And people want certainty on these issues, and it's really hard. And that should be the job of the planning profession, is to deliver certainty. And it's just really hard right now. There have been promises about when this technology was going to be available to the general public. There was a mention during the panel about the different kind of language that gets deployed, and some of it can be deliberately misleading, perhaps in some case, and a lot of it's very marketing oriented. So it's hard to predict the future given the uncertainty surrounding this technology and the world that we live in right now. And I think you can be a little bit sympathetic for planners while still criticizing them for not necessarily preparing for the changes that are coming with transportation technology. And I think that you do see a very uniform response to issues of safety. And I think that that's where it's going to start. You heard the panelists mention that over and over again. And I think that there's a sense that that's where cities are approaching this new technology first. First and foremost, this has to improve safety. And that's where you start to see the breakdown. I think this is a distinction that didn't come out as clearly as it could during the panel. There's so much more space for this technology to be adopted than just transforming the ways that people get to and from work and they do their private trips. And that was mentioned with the logistics and deliveries. You're really talking about if we set aside the ability of autonomous vehicles to change the way that we move around personally in our private lives. You talk about deliveries and logistics, you're still talking about a potential to completely change the built environment. The pandemic has potentially gutted retail spaces all over downtowns. There are people out there that are arguing that companies like Amazon are going to fill those retail spaces to build fulfillment centers and enable a completely different generation of logistics and delivery and completely transform what we think of as commercial corridors. I also want to give a shout out. There was some discussion about pedestrian safety, and there's a great book by a woman named Angie Schmidt called Right of Way. If you want to understand the sort of infrastructural considerations for safety for pedestrians and bike riders and everybody really that uses the street, that's a great book to look at. And those are the really detailed considerations that autonomous vehicles are considering and have to come up against while they're deploying. Let me see what else I got here. I've taken so many notes. I think I'm on track still. So, but I think that one of there are models for the disruptions that we're potentially facing when this technology rolls out. And I think there have been three major transportation disruptions in the last decade. The first one was ride hailing, Uber and Lyft. The second one was scooters or micromobility more generally. And the third one is the pandemic and how that's allowed so many more people to work from home. And it's just really scrambled all of our patterns of transportation that we were so used to. And I think all of those offer a little bit of information about what we can expect and what we can anticipate so that we can start to do that with this next generation of technology innovation. And I think that one other thing that gets lost, and this has been another effect of the COVID pandemic, and this will be my last point, is that transit use has been gutted. And we also have a lot of evidence that ride-hailing companies gutted transit use for the last decade. And transit is the most effective economic and social mobility tool that we have. So if we want to meet a lot of these goals for environmental sustainability, for ensuring social equity, we have to keep transit can be the central idea and the central focus of a lot of these efforts. And that can really make sure that we capture the potential of this new technology and prevent some of the worst effects that we're worried about. And that's what I've got for you. Thank you again.
So I think that's a good way to stop. And I think we haven't heard anything that contradicts from our panel. The idea of rethinking transit and harnessing technology to really evaluate and take a good look at how we can improve operationally transit, but also improve the sustainability and social equity piece. So we're going to take a pause, about a 3-minute break. Thanks to this panel so much. This has been one of the best discussions I've been involved in years. So I want to thank you. And we're going to come back in about 3 minutes and really dive deep on this idea of energy and sustainability in parallel with mobility. So thank you very much. And we'll see you back in a couple minutes. All right, welcome back, everyone. We had an excellent first panel, and if you remember, James summarized us, really focused on this global context, but also talking about how a lot of this is connected, and that the automated industry really is also related to how we think about powering the vehicles of the future. Allison has said before that we need to think on a local level about signs, lines, and potholes, but we also have to think about infrastructure for energy. So with that said, I want to introduce this panel, which is really focused on how we power that future. So first, let me introduce Jade Batstone. And Jade is the Chief Operating Officer, or Chief Executive Officer of Rise Oxygen. And she serves as also as the Global Innovation Manager for Swift. And before that, she was at 5 years at Jack Dorsey's payments company called Square, and she's joining us from London. So Jade, just if you could just say hi and let us hear your voice.
Good thing. Thanks, Billy, for the introduction. Hi, everyone. Really looking forward to taking part in this conversation. What Billy didn't mention is I'm also a USF alumni, so very happy to be part of the conversation today.
Awesome. Yeah. So also, and secondly, I'll introduce Menka Sethi. So Menka is the Chief Operating Officer of American Battery Technology Company. And she's working to revolutionize green energy and with recycling and extraction technology platforms. And prior to that, and if you were listening in on the last panel, we talked a lot about housing. She led location strategy for Facebook and led Facebook's $1 billion housing initiative and issues to address global social mobility and housing. She's a former professor, real estate developer, as well as an architect. Menka?
Thank you, Billy. It's great to be here. And I'm really looking forward to discussing the tactical implications of powering our cities with AV technology and transitioning our day-to-day patterns. And really, what does that mean? New technologies are super exciting, but if we don't do them well and recognize unintended consequences, we can achieve some outcomes that are not so desirable. So really looking forward to talking about how we're leaning in one narrow slice of that solution pool.
Awesome. And capping us off, and I think that Jess Verhagen from Hydra Energy is really focused on the details here. She's Chief Operating Officer of Hydra, which is really focused on this idea of hydrogen as a service. So thinking differently, even about electrification and thinking about maybe hydrogen. And I think that we're seeing the market dictate that hydrogen is potentially one of the future sources of fuel that we can think about. She used to work in London for basically green capital. She worked for an impact fund called Morova Natural Capital, where she raised, I believe, over $100 million fund to look at early stage clean tech companies. And she's also worked on the carbon pricing market. So she's kind of worked in all these different disciplines. And again, if you were listening before and you heard Leah say, it doesn't matter where you're from, you're a great example of that, Jess. So welcome.
Yeah, thank you so much, Billy. It's I'm happy to be here. And just for clarification, it wasn't Morova was in London, and then the other fund for 100 million was here in Vancouver. But I'm really excited to take part in this conversation and talk more about disruptive technology and the business models behind them too that can really scale.
Yeah. So maybe we could just start with you, Jess, then, and then go to Jade and then Menka. That's how you're on my screen here. Just maybe tell us a little bit about who you are and what you do, what your company's all about.
Sure. So as Billy said, I'm the COO of Hydra Energy, where I lead business development and finance, basically anything non-technical. So I'm not an engineer. So as the previous panel talked about, definitely if you're not an engineer or not from a technical background, there's lots of room for you in this space. Hydra is the world's first what we call hydrogen as a service provider for commercial fleets that are looking to reduce their costs and their emissions in the short term, not waiting 10 years for a technology play that may or may not happen. We really have something that's good to go today. So there's limited risk for them and designed in an economic fashion where there's no upfront investment. We quickly convert an existing diesel semi-truck, and then we provide that truck or that fleet with long-term green hydrogen that's derived from waste at below diesel prices. The performance doesn't lose out. You'll get the same fuel efficiency, power, torque, payload capacity. And in terms of range anxiety, if you run out of hydrogen on your trip, the truck just switches automatically to diesel only, so you don't even notice as the driver. So just putting together a package where we can offer something green, but for an even lower cost than conventional energy today.
And so maybe just so before we move on, because I'm not sure if the audience understands the colors of the hydrogen rainbow, could you explain what green hydrogen is as opposed to blue or gray hydrogen?
Sure. It hasn't officially been defined yet by anybody as to, what's the cutoff for being one color versus another. But essentially, gray hydrogen is typically from steam methane reforming. So it's derived from a fossil fuel product. Blue hydrogen is where same process, but then you capture the CO2 emissions from that and sequester them. Green hydrogen is where the hydrogen is derived from either electrification using renewable electricity or some other process. In our case, we're capturing it as waste products, so like a circular economy type of concept.
Cool, thank you, Anne. Jade, maybe introduce what you're doing really quick.
Yeah, absolutely. So as Billy mentioned, I'm CEO of Rise Oxygen, or RO2. And really what we do at Rise Oxygen is provide businesses with a way to meet their climate goals, go climate positive, as we'd say, by investing in renewable energy and actually earning a return on that. So I started RO2 earlier this year because a global pandemic is the best time to start your company, right? But in reality, it came out of this, realizing that not enough businesses today are really doing their part to fight climate change. And a lot of that does have to do with the costs, really, of offsetting your carbon footprint. And especially during really troubled economic times, companies have a hard time really prioritizing their environmental goals, right? Because the ways of offsetting your carbon footprint today that are very popular, paying to plant trees or purchasing carbon credits represent an ongoing operating cost. Meanwhile, I suppose renewable energy sources remain underfunded, and if you look at carbon credits, when you're actually receiving funds for that, it's coming after you already have to produce the energy, right? So with Rise Oxygen, we wanted to really tackle both of those problems by allowing companies to, instead of having to donate or have the cost, they can actually invest in renewable energy upfront. And we can tell you exactly how many kilowatt hours of clean electricity that your business is financing, and you actually earn a return on that portion of the proceeds that the renewable energy provider sells to the grid. So that's what we're looking to do.
Awesome. So Micah, moving from like financing energy to what you do.
Yeah, thank you. So I'm Chief Operating Officer at American Battery Technology Company. And what we do, we're working to increase the production of the primary critical materials that are used in batteries that are increasingly in demand to power things like electric cars, consumer electronics. And more so, we're looking to do this in a way that also addresses climate change and energy security. So we built a clean technology platform. It's a multi-pronged approach to increase production of these critical battery materials, namely nickel, cobalt, manganese, and lithium. First and foremost, we are recycling lithium-ion batteries to recover the battery materials. We're pursuing new ways to extract the battery metals from primary resources through new green technology platforms that can really be deployed at scale. And then third, we're exploring new mineral resources globally of these battery materials while being good stewards of our planet. And I think one thing you'll hear throughout what I say is we do have a two-pronged focus. One is to find the most efficient way to produce the critical battery materials. It's going to be needed much more so in the future as we see demand for things like electric cars increasing tenfold over the next decade. And right now, just to give you a sense of where we're at in terms of recycling and sourcing some of these battery materials globally, we only today recycle about 5% of the battery waste that we spend. So that's 95%. And there's some debate over whether these numbers are global or North American. But we produce or recycle approximately 100,000 metric tons a year right now. And our pilot facility will produce 20,000 metric tons or recycle 20,000 metric tons of these battery materials. So it really does show how far we have to go, how big the opportunity is. And we're extremely passionate about pursuing the technologies, deploying them at scale that do meaningfully address climate change. Because if we don't focus on recycling and new green technologies, what will end up happening is we'll be thinking we're doing well for the environment by driving electric cars, in the previous panel really looking at new ways to deploy autonomous vehicle technology, not just in private auto use, but also in new transit systems like autonomous shuttles that complement new ways that we're trying to deliver housing, so that we're looking at cities holistically. So if we don't pursue the battery metals and some of these really tactical approaches in a way that is green and climate friendly, we're going to end up sourcing those materials from places that do not have environmental safeguards. There are labor abuses, there's political uncertainty. So we see this very much as our business model, but it is a way to address climate change and energy security at the same time.
So you basically took us to this large, huge cognitive window of kind of anthropomorphic climate change, and kind of the impacts of providing power are more than just fueling the vehicles, right there. And so maybe I don't know if you have anything else to say about that, Minka, about kind of that bigger context. But I'd love to kind of hear, when we talk about energy for future vehicles, let's start big. And maybe let's go, so Minka, do you have anything else to add? So when we think about this, what really are the alternatives for producing that energy? Are we we're not producing enough metals to actually provide the power that is going to fuel these vehicles?
Yeah, the alternative is to continue to pull virgin materials out of the ground, and in addition to recycling. So it's going to take time to shift where and how we source the metals or the materials that do power are used in the batteries that power electric cars. And the alternative is what's happening now, which is the materials are being sourced from places around the globe where we're seeing unintended consequences like human trafficking, like really toxic extraction processes that themselves have unintended impacts on local communities. So what we're really invested in, and even as there's so much excitement around this space right now because of the benefits it presents to both society and business models at once. But even within that space, we have to be super diligent about not just taking the quickest path forward, because sometimes the quickest path forward can involve things like high heat burning that emits toxins into the air. So we're being hyper focused at not pursuing any of those alternatives, as you mentioned, and only pursuing the most climate friendly approaches that in turn offer the most efficiency, which in turn offers higher profit level. So this is really doing well by doing good.
Maybe that's awesome, really big framework. And I think what I'd like to do is now kind of to drill down, Jessica. So you can mind just kind of weighing in on kind of, well, what does this mean to actual vehicle operations, whether or not they're an electric vehicle or a hydrogen vehicle? How does this work for you? And then Jake, feel free to interject. Like, how do we pay for all this stuff?
Yeah, Billy, great comments from Minka, and I think it touched earlier on the reasons why Hydra is going for green hydrogen instead of gray hydrogen. When you do a life cycle analysis of what the environmental impacts are, if you end up in a place, which you would if you use gray hydrogen, you replace that with diesel, it's actually more emissions. So that's not helping our cause. It's important, I think, as we look at building new vehicles and new business models, that we build in a full cost accounting of what the implications are. As Minka mentioned, whether it's human trafficking or environmental stewardship, how can we make sure that our business model accounts for that? So in our case, when we're looking at hydrogen, there wouldn't be much point in looking at gray hydrogen, as I mentioned, or if we're looking at hydrogen, but then all of our minerals remain the same. Part of our business model is actually retrofitting existing trucks. So we're using all of the infrastructure that's already out there and simply adding a conversion kit so they can then run on hydrogen, co-combusting with diesel at the same time. And as time goes by, we hope to transition our internal combustion engine to run fully off of hydrogen. But in the meantime, we're at about a 40% displacement. So continuing to up the mark on that, but using as much as we can of existing materials, recycling what we can, and of course using sources of hydrogen that are the lowest greenhouse gas on the life cycle as we can get.
So, I mean, maybe I could just double click on that. I mean, I think what you're saying too, you're suggesting that the fuel cell is nice to have, but you could do this without the fuel cell.
You can, yeah. I think that's often a confusing point. People don't realize that there's alternatives to even the fuel cell within hydrogen. So, and fuel cell vehicles are great, and there's a ton of applications for fuel cells. You can see with Plug Power's forklifts, with the Mirai. What we're focused on is a higher volume application with semi trucks, and in that application, we co-combust diesel within the engine chamber with an air intake that brings hydrogen in as well. So it's a technology that can often be overlooked because fuel cells have so much prominence. And when we get to it later on the policy side of things, it was brought up in the previous panel as well. It's so important to educate policymakers and the general public on these options so we don't inadvertently limit technology options. Where climate change is a huge issue for all of us to deal with, and we need all hands on deck and all solutions on the table.
Yeah, and that's again, the cognitive framework is really important. And I think one of the things to talk about here is that Menka and Jessica, you're working on this from different sides, and we do see a lot of companies, for example, Hylian, Rivian, that have battery and that count on electrification and hydrogen in the future for that 700-mile range electric vehicle. It's really fascinating. But Jade, when we think about, cities, I know tomorrow you're headed to Sweden to we've talked about, here we have some of these cities that are being designed totally around renewable resources. What is the vision for how all this fits together, and then how do you pay for the future of an off the grid community?
Yeah, no, that's right. Well, tomorrow, yeah, as you mentioned, I'm going to Sweden. We're going to this municipality that has a really interesting setup whereby they have solar cells running, and if there is excess electricity that can actually be sent to electrolyzer machines that are separating the hydrogen from the oxygen. The hydrogen can be stored, and then if there's a day where there's not a lot of wind or it's calm, that electricity, that hydrogen can actually be sent to shore up the grid, or sent directly to industry. So it shows how kind of these different technologies can work in tandem and all within one municipality. And then in terms of paying for it, they're looking to deploy a solution like RO2 to enable local businesses to be able to actually invest directly. And I think that's so important because, more and more so you're seeing businesses want to meet their environmental goals, but also have an impact locally, right? That there's more demand around that. And a lot of the current solutions that exist are, planting a forest, or donating to plant trees, or purchasing carbon credits that have been generated in emerging markets. And of course, there are great benefits to those solutions as well, and more so than just the environment, but some of the socioeconomic benefits that come with that. But when we think about these sustainable models and creating these cities that have that kind of circular economy model, how do we allow businesses to plug in directly where they're at? And I think this is one great model. And so hopefully we learn a lot there and can replicate that elsewhere in Europe and maybe one day the US, but let's see how the election goes.
Yeah, and I think it's really important to be specific, and what you're talking about in many of these European communities is we're seeing solar, wind, geothermal power being produced for home consumption, but excess can actually be either sold back to the grid or it can actually be used to power hydrogen electrolyzers. And then that hydrogen can then be stored, in batteries in cars, in batteries in buildings. So we really have, so that hydrogen can use to be power cars. We can actually use the solar or wind or geothermal electricity as a complement to that. So it really is this green circular ecosystem. And I think one of the things I want to pitch it back to you, Minka, is that, wow, this relates to housing, doesn't it? And when we think about this, jobs and housing and transportation become connected around this energy topic. And so how does all this fit together in your mind?
From an urban development perspective, I kind of think of it as we live in our houses and we go to our jobs, and the big connector is the transportation system. So we're focusing about the world's greatest connective tissue when we talk about transportation networks. And when we start to introduce new technologies into that, we start to think about if the houses are closer to the jobs, then there are different types of transportation systems that connect us from our homes to our jobs. And maybe if they're close enough, can move us away from even getting in a vehicle. It might be active modes of transportation. But it depends on how we are able to have the political will to scale where we live. So if we continue our current patterns, which it's a lot of NIMBYism, because we're talking about change, densifying current areas where people have grown to love their single family homes and a white picket fence, not understanding that continuing and perpetuating those type of development patterns also perpetuate use of single occupancy vehicles. It perpetuates racial and income inequality at the same time. So the way to, and one of the most common excuses for not approving this type of higher density housing closer to the jobs is traffic. So if we can really lean in on new technologies in the commute space, such as autonomous vehicles that connect us to more frequent, rapid regional transit systems that then, depending on where you pick them up, you may not have to get into a car as much. So they're reduced trips overall. So it really is the placement of the type of housing near the jobs and then creating that connective tissue in a way that's not increasing greenhouse gas emissions, not increasing vehicle miles traveled, because that in turn decreases equity and access to jobs in a reasonable amount of time. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, and I think like tease something out of there is that I think what I heard was that storing power for the future and producing power for the future doesn't just involve transportation. It involves power storage applications at homes that then actually can then fuel that transportation trip, even if that transportation trip exists. And I think that's a really provocative piece. And I think that's what it's interesting. And Jess, I want to come back to you. It's interesting that you're not focused on the commute side of this. And we just heard Micah say maybe the commute side doesn't exist in many of our particularly our dense urban autonomous vehicle applications. You're focused on the logistics side. It'd be interesting to just hear more about kind of what the use case is. And I want to put a pin in one of the stats you and I talked about is that hydrogen, I believe you told me it's 150 times higher energy density than gasoline. So, what are you seeing in terms of deliveries are the use cases? Is it all long haul trucking, or are there more localized use cases that you're thinking about? You're still muted on Jessica.
Hi, sorry, Billy, thank you. Yeah, hydrogen does have, as you mentioned, 150 times higher density than gasoline. And of course, it's abundant. It's everywhere in the universe. So it is a real opportunity, I think, to go in a more renewable direction and one that meets our climate targets. It's our application at Hydra is currently focused on long haul trucking, but ultimately we'd like to see ourselves as a hydrogen supplier into the future. So currently, although we're focused on using the hydrogen that we acquire to power trucks, we're technology agnostic in a way that we would welcome other applications, whether it be on-road applications, or we've also seen diversification into marine applications, into aviation even, with Zero Avia's first commercial flight off of hydrogen, and now the announcement from Airbus to also use hydrogen. So there's a lot of innovation in this space. There's also the ability to use hydrogen, of course, for heating applications and things to power buildings. So there's a huge range of applications. I think for us, the reason why the focus on trucking is much more of a business and financial decision. In the Hydrogen Council report that they put together every year, they said that the use case where hydrogen is the most cost competitive with fossil fuel solutions is actually in trucking. So using hydrogen in an internal combustion engine or in fuel cells are ways that we can get trucking off the ground. And for us, we've been working with these existing trucks for over 3 years on the road and commercial routes. So certainly we've gathered a lot of data and kind of connecting back to the previous panel. We see the way to most quickly scale our solution is to take advantage of machine learning and automation to get to a point where we can, for example, automatically calibrate trucks instead of manually as we do now. So we're continuing to collect that data to use in hopes of furthering our R&D efforts to get it to a more automated place.
Yeah, and I think that for the three of you, I'll just assume that the convergence of software and AI technology and what you're doing is going to impact all three of you. But maybe let's actually pivot to just kind of a more open-ended question. Okay, so you're doing really interesting stuff in terms of how we power the future of homes and transportation. But so what does that mean? What are the obstacles or the threats to you achieving this goal? And then what are some policies that we need to think about to be able to get there? Whoever wants to take it first. Okay, Jade, you're gonna take it.
I can take it. Yeah, I can go first. I think, and this is a challenge for me. I mean, I guess a bit of my background, as Billy mentioned, I'm new to this space. Most of my background has been in payments and actually financial technology, and coming up with Square for many years. One of the things that always resonated with me about that company was how Jack Dorsey really took an industry like the credit card processing industry that was horribly ripping off small businesses by having these very opaque kind of fees and actually created a very simple, straightforward solution to kind of cut through all the BS. And kind of in a very similar way, I'm looking at a space where many businesses are wanting to meet their environmental goals. They're wanting to contribute to a climate positive future, but actually, the opportunities that they have purchasing carbon credits, it's very opaque as well, right? It's not very transparent as to, okay, if I purchase 1,000 carbon credits, or I pay eight pounds per ton of carbon that I emit, what actually happens with those funds, right? You're not actually creating more capacity for generating clean electricity. It's a digital asset, right? That's been traded and exchanged hands and exchanged value, but it's not very clear how you are actually then having that impact. And I actually went through a process with some of our pilot renewable energy providers where I said, okay, let's say that a company did pay £8 for a carbon credit that's generated in your facility. How much of those funds would actually even reach you? And 25% of that, I've been reported, would be going to middlemen really in that process, right? So like the exchanges that it's put on, the registry, and at the end of the day, it's such a small figure. But when we actually look at businesses who have the right intentions, they're wanting to offset their carbon footprints. And we go with a model like RO2s, where we say, okay, why don't you finance an equivalent amount of kilowatt hours of clean electricity as you are offsetting in carbon? Actually, that figure is a lot higher. So really, there's this market that we're trying to work around where we want to say, okay, that amount that you paid for carbon credits, how many kilowatt hours of clean electricity would that actually have generated? Versus if you're investing with RO2, we can tell you an exact number. So we have to kind of get away from this whole carbon offset, carbon neutral language and actually talk about impact. And that is a challenge because it is going to cost a bit more. But that's why we're trying to create financial incentives and making it an investment for businesses so we can move more towards that future.
Yeah, I think that's really important to emphasize too, because the whole environment, ESG investment industry, which is supposed to be about a $17 billion investment industry, is not set up to direct fund innovation. So the question there is, how do you create mechanisms, financial mechanisms that go right into investing in energy, in battery technology? And maybe it sounds to me like you're saying, hey, it's by creating innovative companies or innovative funds that actually just directly do that. And I know that this is where Just Business has actually really been focused on that. This is Professor Dave Batstone, who also runs a social impact VC from USF, has been really instrumental, and I know is invested in all three of your companies in terms of really trying to figure out how we transform climate at the same time and really like actualizing the funding, as opposed to having a bunch of ancillary skim offs or something like that. So not very well put, but I do want to focus more on just kind of this idea of what are the impediments, particularly to seeing the physical infrastructure go by. So make what do you see as kind of the impediments to actualizing the vision of creating all this new battery supply material for us to power the future of EVs, of homes, et cetera?
One of the key ways that we can incentivize or support development of the technology is to look at the regulations in place that we have to navigate to actually build our facilities. And it's one of the key reasons why our first facility will be constructed in the state of Nevada, because Nevada recognizes that a company like ours is proposing the most green technology on the planet. We do not emit, we do not have high burning processes. We have very low water use. In fact, it's completely closed loop recycled on our site. So if it comes out of our facility, it's cleaner than when it does enter our facility. And at the same time, because our business model is robust, we can commit to paying living wages. So this really is, it's beneficial, we strongly believe, to the community. And we've selected to build in Nevada because it recognizes that to get a new technology that's incredibly green off the ground, we need support from a regulatory standpoint. So that means efficient ways to build plants, not getting caught in as much red tape as other areas might present. And the reason why that's significant is right now, we as the United States are losing this type of business to other areas around the globe that do not have such many steps, hurdles that you have to go through. And that can sound good and that can sound bad, but there is a way to do this for green technologies that ensures environmental safety, that ensures benefits to the community, that is not so onerous that it takes years to get a facility permitted. If we continue to take years to allow the permitting processes to play out, guess what? We're going to source materials from other places on the planet that don't have any environmental frameworks, that have labor abuses, that have political uncertainty. So the best thing we can do is to lean into the current regulatory system we have in place and provide some clarity where there's currently ambiguity. So this is not a complete system redo that we need for regulation. The EPA laws that we have in place are robust, they're on point. There are ambiguities that can be clarified so that we can move faster.
Yeah, I love the way you framed it in terms of opportunity cost too, because then I think we should, from an academic standpoint, we know that China has been doing ample strip mining for metals to provide this power, and a certain large swath, I don't know the percentage, but I think it's around 5% of the Amazon rainforest actually was bulldozed for lithium extraction, if I'm not mistaken. So I mean, when you think about that, not only are we losing in terms of the human impacts, but actually the carbon offsets from the rainforest are lost as well. And
that's exactly right. And we're also, I just want to also point out the other thing that we're losing out on by not polishing our regulatory system is clean tech manufacturing jobs. This is a massive opportunity to bring back really good paying manufacturing jobs to our home communities.
Yeah, and I think I love the fact that we have a global perspective here. One of the things that we are seeing a lot of talk about is the Green New Deal here in the U.S. And you probably, those of you in London and Canada have heard about it. No matter who is elected, we are going to see. I do think that we're going to have to see more green tech jobs. and maybe a green tech czar. And I think it's important to think about what our next door neighbors are doing in Canada. So Jessica, I want to hear, and I want to dive deep just kind of real quick on what happened in Canada recently, and even last week with the election, and how what Canada is doing to really support the clean energy transition.
Sure, thanks, Billy. I mean, we're always paying close attention to what's happening in the US, and particularly in California. BC and California has a long history of working together and harmonizing policies. I used to work in the British Columbia government and spent a lot of time in California actually working on common vehicle standards, cap and trade system, anything carbon pricing related. So there was an election that happened just provincially here in British Columbia, and it was an interesting one because climate change was such a nonpartisan issue, which I'm sure would be quite different from what happens in the US. But the party that got in supported climate change, as did its major competitors. But when I think about the policies that would help not only our company, but other companies that are doing innovations around vehicle technology and transportation, I think, of course, I'm biased on having a carbon price, but specifically the low carbon fuel standard has been really helpful for us. It values the carbon intensity of the fuels dropping and recognizes, we were talking about before in the hydrogen rainbow, because you have to quantify the life cycle emission reduction potential of your technology versus diesel or gasoline. It really enables a quantitative understanding of that shift. And then additionally, because we can also use the hydrogen in pipelines that currently carry natural gas, but under government mandate have a renewable gas content requirement that they now have to meet. In British Columbia, it's 30% by 2030. It's 15% by 2030. That's my ideal. It'd be 30%, but it's actually 15% is the government mandate of renewable content by 2030. So that means natural gas flowing through pipelines will have to contain, up to 15% renewable gas. And one of the big upcoming policies that is being hopefully going through in British Columbia is on defining what are those renewable gases, and hopefully hydrogen will be included in that. But then I don't think it's just on the government shoulders. I think there's also things in the private sector that we've seen that can be really helpful to encourage greener options when it comes to trucking. For example, most of the fleets that we work with, they're contract fleets to other companies. So as soon as we see those other companies demand greener solutions, when they actually credit in their RFPs going green, having greener fuel, having greener practices, and then the benefits to the trucking sector that may not be obvious, and links back to the previous discussion on the labor shortage in the last panel. There is a labor shortage right now for truckers, and our Canadian Trucking Association and provincial affiliates did a survey to find out what's the main block for labor in this industry. There's enough labor to go into trucking, but why are they choosing other options? One of the big factors was because they're not perceived to be sustainable in today's world, and the values, particularly that millennials have. They value buying things that are green, working for green companies, investing in green. So providing an alternative future and a better image for trucking would also enable them to attract more talent. And that's been a big pillar of what the subsequent communications campaign will be from trucking associations across Canada, is really showing where green technology is starting to gain some traction and hopefully attract more drivers.
Yeah, and I want to go back to one thing. It's like one of the things that the U.S. has is a gas tax. And I think what you're seeing in Canada is that there's other ways to approach incentivizing carbonless or less carbon intensive fuel types that may be more effective than a gas tax. And we don't have to dive into that, but I think it's important to clearly illustrate. Jade, any thoughts on this topic? I know a little out of field, but anything you're aware of?
Yeah, I mean, I'm sitting over here in London, and just this past week, Boris Johnson announced that by 2030, every home in the UK will be powered by wind. So the government has just invested 160 million pounds to facilitate factories. They're saying there's going to be 60,000 plus jobs around building these wind turbines. And that's UK is going to be a world leader in wind. So Boris Johnson makes a lot of promises. Let's see how this goes. But I think it does highlight, I think there was some mention, I think Jessica, you mentioned as well, that in Canada, it's climate change. It's not a partisan issue. And, for those of you who don't know, Boris Johnson is part of what would be probably considered the Conservative Party in equivalent terms, so to speak. But it's something that, this green industrial revolution and promising to come out of COVID, greener and accelerating towards net zero emissions by 2050 is something that we can all talk about. So it's definitely happening over here.
That's really interesting. And I think one thing I'll put in is that I used to work in Lincolnshire, which is the East Midlands of the UK. And what this gesture really means is that, it was not easy to get the North Sea offshore wind farms approved. There was a lot of pushback. And I think what we're seeing is this national initiative. And for all my friends in wind farm in Lincolnshire that actually really struggled with this idea of changing the traditional British landscape, I think they've recognized that evolution is a part of what our cities have to do. And I think it's a really good place to kind of swing back to Menka and say, like, okay, if we're gonna revolutionize our cities, our transportation, but also our housing, and we're gonna do it through clean energy, what kind of partnerships do we need to do that? And maybe, so start off with Menka, and then quickly Jessica and Jade, and then we'll start to wrap up.
Right now, the key partnerships I see that are needed are between industry and governments of all level, because the industries to operate are subject to the regulatory systems that the governments have put in place. And that's everything from operating your business to building something physical coming out of the ground. And right now, the technologies are evolving so quickly that the regulatory frameworks are trailing in how fast and nimble they are to allow us to continue to innovate. So I do think that is the most critical partnership. The other critical partnership I'll just call out is the relationship with local communities. We're heavily invested in being a long-term contributor to the local communities where we are located. So we see that as that relationship can be really solid. It helps us establish trust so that we can continue to find the regulatory systems that will allow us to innovate. And by building the trust, we build the foundation for less tape that we have to navigate before we can innovate, because otherwise we'll be out-innovated, outpaced by the rest of the world.
That's great. Jade?
Yeah, I definitely agree on this point on public-private sector collaboration. I think we talk about those, the municipalities I mentioned in Sweden, where they have this model in place. They're looking to fuel infrastructure, right? So they're looking to fuel local busing and transportation, and that takes collaborations with local municipalities, right? So we definitely need everyone, all hands on deck for this.
And I think it's one of the, we should just admit that public-private partnerships are not easy. But what the last panel said is that COVID-19 is really an opportunity for us to think about this, for us to think about local jobs, local social mobility programs, human dignity at the local level, and how that cascades up levels of government, but also benefits innovative businesses like the three of yours. Jessica, any final words on this?
Sure, I definitely agree with Micah and Jade on having the cross collaboration between the public and private sector, but then there's also within the public sector, I think the previous panel commented that transportation, of course, by its nature, goes across many different jurisdictions, so having government within its various level collaborate amongst themselves as well. And then within the private sector, I think there's some collaboration that can be had, for example, on communication campaigns, education, and then with, I know we had talked briefly before this session, Billy, about the OEM market and how do new technologies plug into the OEM market. And that's a whole set of private to private partnerships that I see as really important. And then building on the local community angle, where the community that we're active in, we're also mindful of First Nations partnerships because they, there's a historical legacy there and an ongoing interest in working on economic development and making sure that they're part of thinking through job creation and all the things that Menka had highlighted in her response. We're conscious of that for Indigenous opportunities as well.
Yeah, there's a word in the management profession called co-opetition. So this idea of cooperation and competition coexisting, and I knew that's a good word to end up on this, is that it doesn't have to be a competition among private sector companies. It could be co-opetition. So, I closed out the last panel with just kind of, we do have a lot of students and a lot of people that are interested in career switching, and a lot of, particularly the companies at your stages, getting good talent and getting good people in the door to help you continue to innovate is really important. So, I'd ask, what would you say to young people interested in what you're doing, particularly young women that want to enter into these kinds of fields? Any advice or words of wisdom? Maybe Jade, go ahead.
Yeah, I really resonated with, for those who were on the previous panel, I think Allison mentioned about translatable skills, right? And how actually your learnings from one industry can actually really propel you and actually allow you to have different vantage points in another that are quite valuable. And I've seen that really transitioning from financial services and tech into this space, and how some of the same principles can be applied around making things more simple and transparent. And so I definitely resonate with that piece quite a bit, and I would push that forward to those who are interested in going into the sector. And then the other piece that I would say is follow your curiosity. And this all came to me in terms of this business concept because I couldn't quite wrap my hands around what a carbon credit actually meant for a business. Like, what are they actually doing? What does it mean to be carbon neutral? And started to kind of unwrap the layers there and realized actually, well, there's a reason I don't understand this, is because it's actually not very clear. And if I don't understand it, it means a lot of businesses don't either. So how can I make a solution that is much better, I suppose. So those are the two things I would say.
Maybe Jessica?
Yeah, definitely. What Jade said about curiosity is a great point. I think that also kind of helps you to discover what your passion is. Prashanthi had also mentioned on the previous panel, having a personal board of advisors, having that mentorship around you to show you different paths and alternatives as you go down, so you don't lock too much into one area. And I've also found it really helpful to just, I guess as a woman in such a male-dominated field, because I'm at the cross-section of finance and tech, I've heard figures of as high as 95% male. It's just, I found it really helpful to have almost a support group around, because sometimes there is an awkward experience or something difficult that you come across, and it's nice to have somebody that you can talk to that knows your experience, but have had similar experiences, so you don't feel isolated, you don't feel like you're alone, that there's people out there that can help you.
Okay, words of wisdom.
I think +1 to a lot of what both Jessica and Jade have just said. I would say one word of advice: you don't have to be an engineer to have impact. I have a technical background in the sense I'm a licensed architect, but I see a lot of, and I teach at Cal Poly as well to undergrad students. So I hear this daily that I don't have the technical background to have impact. That is absolutely not the case. Yes, we need engineers to develop new technologies, but new technologies in and of themselves don't just become a business. You have to surround that technology with a really rich ecosystem of different knowledge bases. So if you are passionate in this area, there's absolutely a space for you. And then +1 to what Jessica said about just being cognizant of what the technology space is comprised of now, which is not as many women or races that reflect the general population, and don't let that deter you. I feel really privileged to have broken the glass ceiling, and the way I've been able to do that, and I would recommend as well that you surround yourself with a supportive mentorship system, a supportive set of advisors who can pick you up and tell you, speak up, your voice is valued. It's not only the engineers who speak loudest. It doesn't mean that your voice is not valued. And sometimes you just have to be reminded of that, because right now the ecosystem that we work in isn't really set up to promote that. So I think allyship is huge, and surround yourself with allies.
That's awesome way to end our discussion. So James, I wanted to take some time to give you, this has been a big topic, and we, there's a lot that relates to how we think about the future of our cities. Any kind of response to what you've heard, and to this panel, how it links to the last panel, go for it.
Sure. Thanks, everybody, all the panelists. That was a really great discussion again. And I think, just the premise of pairing a discussion about renewable technologies and the financialization of renewable technologies with the discussion about autonomous vehicles is really exciting and powerful, so that we get that broader sense that Billy just mentioned. And I think one of the most particularly exciting things about this panel in particular is that these renewable energy technologies don't need AVs to be transformative. And I think that one of the frameworks for understanding that I approach both these discussions from is this idea of the rural-urban transect. And if you're not familiar with that, that's a term from planning that actually goes back to the beginning of the 20th century, but it was updated in the 80s and 90s by this movement called New Urbanism. But it's kind of like a cross-section of what kind of impact the built environment has on the natural environment, and how much built environment, and that includes transportation infrastructure, how much of that is included in the natural environment. And if you start to think about things in terms of their impact in different parts of this rural to urban transect, you can really start to understand how, Jessica kept mentioning life cycle analysis. You can understand where the life cycle has different impacts in different places at different moments in the life cycle. And I think that the rural to urban transect is also really powerful to start to anticipate how these transformative technologies are going to completely change the equation of the impact of our transportation systems, our energy systems. And, the potential is there. And I think that this is an optimistic way to look at it. And we all need a little optimism, but you can really start thinking about parts of the world that are less than sustainable now, and even environmentally destructive, becoming much more sustainable. Is it easier to retrofit, renewable energy systems into the transportation system? Is that easier in the suburbs? Potentially it is than it is in urban environments. And if we start to look for opportunities, I think the discussion kind of ended up with public-private partnerships. And I think that there are some US cases, and Sweden got mentioned a bunch of times. And I think that there's great examples for the cutting edge of sustainability planning in Sweden. But there's also a lot of examples in the United States that are more equity focused. And there are a lot of cities around the United States that are doing climate action plans right now, including cities that might very, very much surprise you: Houston, Austin, all over and those are opportunities for these discussions about renewable energy to start to plug into a partnership with the public sector. And there are also other cities, Minnesota and Flint have created these eco-district planning programs where they're integrating social equity with environmental justice and into their planning and into the kind of developments they allow and into the kind of technologies that they're welcoming. So there are opportunities for public-private partnerships in the US. And the other thing about the transect and about this holistic approach to these subjects is there's another book that came out this year. I mentioned Right of Way by Angie Schmidt in the last panel, but there's another book called Ghost Road by Anthony M. Townsend. And one of the big themes that he talks about, and I think that really you have to consider this when you're considering this holistic or transect view of all these issues, is the financialization of all these technologies. And he's very concerned in this book about the potential of bad actors in the financialization, like similar to Enron in the energy. So once you start talking about all these different ways to plug in to this transportation evolution, there's lots of different ways for financial bad actors to take control either of the politics or the finances of these systems that we rely on to drive our economy and keep us all fed and alive. So that's just another issue to consider. And at risk of ending on maybe a slightly down note, it's just really useful to think about it holistically. And I really applaud Billy for setting it up that way. That's it. Thank you.
Thank you, James. Yeah, so I just want to underscore that is that housing, transportation, we cannot think about them in a non-ecosystem approach, and that ecosystem involves us thinking about planetary ecosystem, our planetary ecosystem, our economic framework, as well as how we think about social equity and human dignity. And so kind of there's some final thoughts. And I first off want to thank all the panelists. What an amazing group of women. And thanks for the advice you have for students. I could not agree more. And it's good advice for men or women. It's good advice across the board to look for allies and to be an ally. And so I want to underscore that quite deliberately and strongly. But at the same time, I just want to emphasize that when we think about kind of this big topic, I think there are three big takeaways that I want to hit on. Is that one, this industry, and you can see from these individuals on this panel and the individual on the last panel are working on this from different angles. They're working on the future of climate and from different angles, thinking about people, planet, and profit. It is broad. It requires people with different skills from different industries. And it's not just a discussion about transportation. I think we heard it over and over again. It's about housing, it's about economics, it's about social mobility. And that's really important for us to consider. Secondly, the big context is climate, human dignity. And it's not something that has a political party. And it's important to emphasize, and I'm only gonna say this once, in the US, you need to vote. And I wanna emphasize that again. This knows no party. And finally, I think we saw this from both panels that there's an opportunity, we're going to underscore the word for co-opetition. This idea that we don't have to see, yes, we need to be worried about, and we can be worried about making sure that we don't have bad actors. But there's an opportunity for public-private partnership and public-public partnership and private-private partnership. The first panel talked about signs, lines, and potholes, things that cities can do today, but it's stuff that neighbors can do. It's stuff that you can do in your own backyard in terms of reframing what your own street looks like. We need to think about electrification and recycling. Don't throw that power tool battery away. It sounds like Menka wants to recycle it. But also it's thinking about how our own relationship with transit. And it's becoming that advocate, but also that rider. It's thinking about how many of these future technologies for transit may look different. Transit may not look like the bus of the future, may not look like the bus of the past. And then finally, I think we have to underscore, every panelist here has talked about labor and human dignity. And we have to underscore that at the local, the state, and the federal level. And I think that's just a final passing point that is really important. And for those of you that are USF friends and alumnus, you know that really aligns with our Jesuit values and how we value human beings as well as the planet. So with that, I want to thank this panel, the prior panel. This has been an interesting time, and this has been an awesome way to hold our 4th annual Autonomous Vehicle Symposium, focused on these two critical and linked topics. Thank you so much. We appreciate your support, and we appreciate all the panelists, and we look forward, and hopefully we'll have some of these panelists come back next year and talk about how they're continuing to innovate for good in society. So thank you so much. Thank you, James. And we look forward to welcoming you back next year.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Bye now.